August 23, 1971. A scorching Texas morning. A mother leaves for work, trusting a stranger she's never met with her 21-month-old daughter. By nightfall, that little girl, Melissa Highsmith, has vanished without a trace. No witnesses, no ransom, no clues. Just a woman in white gloves and a polite smile, carrying a baby into oblivion. For 51 years, Melissa's face would age on missing posters while her family aged in anguish. Detectives retired. Technology evolved. The world moved on. But one thing never changed: a mother's refusal to forget. And then, in November 2022, something impossible happened. A father spit into a plastic tube. A notification pinged on a screen. And the longest cold case child abduction in American history cracked wide open. The answer? It was hiding in plain sight all along, just a few miles away, living a completely different life, unaware that she was the girl everyone had been searching for. This is the story of how DNA, determination, and a half-century of hope collided to rewrite one family's history. Before we dive into this incredible journey, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you believe in never giving up. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe to Cold Case Chronicles so you never miss stories like this one. These cases need our attention. These families need our support. And together, we keep hope alive. Now, let's uncover the truth. Summer in Fort Worth, Texas, 1971, wasn't just hot. It was the kind of sweltering that makes asphalt shimmer and tempers run short. The city's working-class neighborhoods hummed with the rhythm of survival, families doing whatever it took to keep food on the table and roofs overhead. Among those families was 22-year-old Alta Apantenco, a young mother navigating the choppy waters of single parenthood with determination that belied her years. Her daughter, Melissa, was 21 months old, just old enough to toddle around with that wobbly confidence that makes parents both proud and terrified. Alta's days blurred together in an exhausting pattern of double shifts at the restaurant where she waitressed, stolen moments with her baby girl, and the constant mathematical anxiety of making rent meet reality. She'd recently separated from Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highsmith, and while the split had been necessary, it left her facing the brutal economics of solo parenting in an era when childcare options for working mothers were limited and expensive. The apartment Alta shared with a roommate on East Seminary Drive wasn't much, but it was theirs. The Spanish Gate Apartments stood as one of those functional, no-frills complexes that dotted American cities in the 70s. Places where people landed temporarily, but sometimes stayed for years because moving required money they didn't have. Alta kept Melissa's corner of their shared space tidy, filled with the modest toys she could afford and the boundless love that cost nothing. But love, as Alta was learning the hard way, didn't solve the problem of who would watch Melissa while she worked those long shifts that kept them fed. Family wasn't an option. Her relatives lived too far away to help with daily childcare. Professional daycare centers, the few that existed, cost more than she could manage on a waitress's income. So Alta did what countless parents in her situation did in that pre-internet era. She turned to the classified ads section of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and placed a simple request for a weekday babysitter. It seemed so ordinary at the time, so unremarkable. Just a few lines of text in a newspaper column filled with similar requests. People looking for work, people offering services, the mundane machinery of community connection. Alta couldn't have known that somewhere in Fort Worth, someone was reading those ads with predatory intent. Couldn't have imagined that her straightforward plea for childcare help would be the thread that unraveled her entire world. Within days of the ad running, Alta received a phone call that would change everything. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Ruth Johnson, and everything about her voice suggested trustworthiness. She spoke softly but clearly, with the kind of measured confidence that makes you believe someone knows what they're doing. She explained that she had years of experience caring for children, that she lived in a nice home with a big yard where little ones could play safely. Her tone was warm without being overly familiar, professional without being cold. She was, in every way that mattered to a desperate mother, exactly what Alta needed to hear. They made arrangements to meet in person at the restaurant where Alta worked, a sensible precaution that showed Alta was being careful. But when the agreed-upon day arrived, Ruth Johnson didn't show up. Instead, she called with apologies, explaining that an unexpected conflict had prevented her from making the meeting. She expressed continued interest in the position, asked about Melissa's age and needs, and maintained that calm, reassuring demeanor that had impressed Alta during their first conversation. And here's where the terrible machinery of manipulation clicked into place. Ruth's persistence, her apparent sincerity, and the gentle pressure of Alta's increasingly desperate need for reliable childcare converged into a decision that Alta would replay in her mind for the next 5 decades. Pressed by her tightening work schedule and with no other viable options emerging, Alta made the choice to hire Ruth Johnson over the phone, sight unseen. In the context of 1971, in a working-class neighborhood where people still largely trusted their neighbors and strangers could still be given the benefit of the doubt, it wasn't an incomprehensible decision. It was just a mother trying to survive. The morning of August 23, 1971, began like any other for Alta. She left early for her shift, kissing Melissa goodbye before heading out into the already building heat. The plan was simple. Alta's roommate would hand Melissa off to the new babysitter later that morning, and Alta would pick her up after work. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new routine that would ease the constant stress of juggling motherhood and minimum wage work. Instead, it was the last morning that life would ever be normal. Around 9 o'clock, a woman arrived at the Spanish Gate Apartments. Alta's roommate, expecting the babysitter, greeted her at the door and noted that she matched Alta's description of Ruth Johnson, or at least, she seemed professional and put together enough to be the person they were expecting. But even in that first moment, something was off. Texas in August is an oven, the kind of heat that makes you strip down to the bare minimum of socially acceptable clothing just to stay functional. Yet this woman was dressed as if she were attending a formal winter event. She wore long white gloves that extended past her wrists, covering her hands and forearms completely. A scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck despite the sweltering temperature, and a bonnet or large hat obscured much of her hair and face. The outfit was meticulous, almost theatrical in its completeness. The roommate found it strange. Who dresses like that in 100-degree weather? But the woman's demeanor was so calm and pleasant that the oddity of her appearance seemed like just that, an oddity. Maybe she had sensitive skin. Maybe she was just old-fashioned. Maybe it didn't matter because Alta had hired her and Alta trusted her judgment. The exchange itself was brief and unremarkable. The roommate handed over Melissa, along with a diaper bag containing everything a toddler might need for a day of care: bottles, diapers, a change of clothes. Melissa, too young to understand that anything was wrong, didn't resist. The woman settled the little girl on her hip with practiced ease, thanked the roommate politely, and walked away from the apartment. The roommate watched her go, closing the door without a second thought, completely unaware that she'd just witnessed a kidnapping. By the time the woman reached the street and turned the corner, she had effectively vanished. No one saw which direction she went. No one noticed a car or a cab. No one remembered seeing a woman in white gloves carrying a child, which in retrospect seems impossible, but speaks to how easily the ordinary can swallow the extraordinary when no one knows they're supposed to be paying attention. When Alta returned home that evening, she expected to find Melissa playing or napping, expected to hear about how the first day with the new babysitter had gone. Instead, she walked into silence. Melissa wasn't in her crib. Her toys sat untouched. The apartment felt wrong in a way that Alta couldn't immediately articulate, but felt in her bones. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe the babysitter had taken Melissa out for a walk and lost track of time. Maybe they'd gone to the park. Maybe there was a simple explanation that would reveal itself any minute. But as minutes stretched into an hour with no phone call, no note, no sign of her daughter, that initial confusion curdled into something much darker. Alta called neighbors, asking if anyone had seen a woman with a small child. No one had. She checked with the apartment complex office, thinking perhaps a message had been left there. Nothing. By the time the sun set over Fort Worth that evening, Alta knew with terrible certainty that something was catastrophically wrong. She called the Fort Worth Police Department shortly after 8 o'clock, her voice shaking as she reported her daughter missing. Officers arrived quickly, their presence both reassuring and terrifying because it made the situation undeniably real. They took statements from Alta and her roommate, asking for every detail they could remember about the woman who had taken Melissa. The description they pieced together was simultaneously specific and useless: a well-dressed woman who had deliberately obscured every identifying feature. The white gloves would have prevented fingerprints. The bonnet and scarf hid her hair color, style, and much of her face. Even her clothing, while neat and formal, was generic enough to be untraceable. It was the work of someone who had planned this carefully, someone who understood exactly how to make herself unmemorable while appearing trustworthy enough to be handed a child. The police immediately began checking for anyone named Ruth Johnson in the Fort Worth area who matched the vague description they had. They found nothing useful. The name was common enough to be essentially anonymous, and without more specific identifiers, it led nowhere. By the next morning, Fort Worth police were canvassing the Spanish Gate Apartments complex and surrounding neighborhood with a growing sense of urgency. They showed Melissa's photograph to every resident they could find, asking if anyone had noticed a woman carrying a toddler on the morning of August 23rd. The responses were universally unhelpful. No one had seen anything unusual. Detectives visited nearby shops, restaurants, and gas stations, hoping someone might remember a woman in strange attire carrying a child. Again, nothing. They reached out to local transit authorities, bus drivers, and taxi companies, thinking perhaps the kidnapper had used public transportation to leave the area. Every lead evaporated. Hospitals and clinics throughout the region were alerted in case the child was brought in for any reason, but no one matching Melissa's description appeared. The investigation expanded to include searches of vacant lots, wooded areas, and drainage ditches near highways. Grim work that acknowledged the possibility that Melissa might no longer be alive. But those searches turned up nothing either. It was as if the woman in white gloves had opened a door to another dimension, stepped through with Melissa, and closed it behind them. Within 48 hours of Melissa's disappearance, the FBI became involved, classifying the case as a kidnapping under federal jurisdiction. Wanted posters featuring Melissa's cherubic face were distributed across Texas and neighboring states. Newspapers ran the story prominently, with headlines that read "Fort Worth toddler missing" and "Police seek woman in baby abduction." Television news programs showed Alta's tearful pleas for her daughter's return, her face twisted with anguish that was raw and real and heartbreaking to witness. But despite the initial flurry of activity and public attention, the investigation hit a wall almost immediately. This was 1971, and the investigative tools available to police were limited in ways that seem almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective. There were no surveillance cameras recording street corners or storefronts. There was no internet to spread information instantaneously across the country. There were no cell phone records to trace or credit card transactions to follow. The mysterious babysitter had arranged everything through untraceable phone calls, likely made from public payphones, so there was no number to investigate. She'd never provided an address or any verifiable personal information. She'd worn gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and had disguised her appearance to prevent accurate identification. Every traditional investigative avenue, witness testimony, physical evidence, traceable communications, had been deliberately cut off by someone who clearly understood how to commit a crime and disappear. The trail wasn't just cold. It had never really been warm to begin with. By the end of August 1971, just a week after Melissa vanished, Fort Worth police were forced to acknowledge what they'd probably suspected from the start. They had almost nothing to work with. No suspects. No witnesses who could provide useful descriptions. No physical evidence. No ransom demand that might provide leverage or clues. Just a missing child, a devastated mother, and a ghost in white gloves who had executed one of the most complete disappearances in the city's history. The days immediately following Melissa's disappearance were a blur of frantic activity that gradually, painfully, gave way to the grim reality of a case going cold. For Alta Apantenco, those first weeks felt like drowning in slow motion. Every breath a struggle, every moment weighed down by the absence of her daughter. She quit her job at the restaurant, unable to focus on anything but the search. Her days became defined by police interviews, where detectives asked the same questions over and over, probing for any detail she might have forgotten, any inconsistency in her story that might suggest she knew more than she was saying. This is standard procedure in missing child cases. Investigators have to rule out family involvement before they can focus entirely on external suspects. But for Alta, it added insult to the injury of her loss. Here she was, living through every parent's worst nightmare, and she had to endure questioning that implied she might somehow be responsible. The psychological toll was immense. She'd replay the decision to hire Ruth Johnson over the phone hundreds of times, torturing herself with what-ifs that served no purpose except to deepen her guilt. What if she'd insisted on meeting in person? What if she'd waited a few more days to find someone else? What if she'd asked more questions, demanded references, been less trusting? These thoughts circled endlessly, a mental prison with no escape. Jeffrey Highsmith, Melissa's father, was also quickly drawn into the investigation's orbit. Though he and Alta had separated, their shared loss reunited them in the worst possible way. Police questioned him extensively about his whereabouts on August 23rd, his relationship with Alta, and whether he might have had any involvement in Melissa's disappearance. Perhaps this was a custody dispute gone wrong? Perhaps a relative on his side of the family had taken the child? But Jeffrey's alibi was solid, his grief genuine, and his background clean. There was no evidence whatsoever suggesting he or anyone in his circle had orchestrated the abduction. Both parents were eventually cleared, which should have brought some relief, but instead just narrowed the terrifying possibilities to the most frightening option. A stranger had taken their child, and that stranger could be anyone, anywhere. The randomness of it was almost harder to bear than if there had been a clear motive or suspect. At least with a known enemy, you have something to direct your anger toward. With a phantom, you're left swinging at shadows. The Fort Worth community rallied in those early days with the kind of solidarity that emerges in the face of collective horror. Volunteers organized search parties that combed through vacant lots, fields, and wooded areas surrounding the city, looking for any trace of Melissa, a piece of clothing, a shoe, the bow Alta had put in her hair that morning. Dozens of people showed up, strangers who felt compelled to do something, anything, rather than sit idly by while a child remained missing. They walked in lines through tall grass and brush, calling Melissa's name even though they knew a 21-month-old wouldn't respond, even though they feared what they might actually find. Churches throughout Fort Worth held prayer vigils, their congregations gathering to ask for Melissa's safe return and to support Alta through her unimaginable ordeal. Local businesses posted Melissa's picture in their windows. Parents throughout the city held their own children a little tighter and checked their locks a little more carefully, suddenly aware of how fragile safety really is. But despite all this community support, despite hundreds of volunteer hours and thousands of prayers, no credible leads emerged. Not one person came forward with useful information. The woman in white gloves had committed the perfect crime. Perfect in its execution, devastating in its completeness. As August faded into September and then October, the media coverage that had initially amplified Melissa's story began to wane. This is the terrible rhythm of news cycles. Even the most heartbreaking stories eventually get displaced by newer tragedies, different headlines. Melissa's case moved from the front page to the inside sections, then appeared less frequently, and finally stopped appearing at all except on anniversaries of her disappearance. The Fort Worth Star-Telegram would occasionally run follow-up pieces asking if anyone had information, but these generated little response beyond the usual false leads and well-meaning but unhelpful tips that go nowhere. The FBI maintained their involvement for several months, but as 1971 turned into 1972 with no breaks in the case, even federal resources began to redirect toward newer investigations. Melissa's file remained officially open, but the active investigation scaled back significantly. Detectives moved on to other cases, their time and attention pulled by the demands of fresh crimes that had actual evidence to pursue. Melissa Highsmith's disappearance was transferred from the Active Investigation Division to the Cold Case Files, where it would remain for the next 5 decades. For Alta, this shift from urgent investigation to dormant case file was almost as painful as the initial loss. When police are actively searching, when media is covering the story, when volunteers are organizing search parties, there's at least the sense that something is being done, that momentum exists, that hope has a foundation. But when all that activity fades, when the phone stops ringing with updates, when you realize that the world has moved on while your personal nightmare continues unabated, that's when the true loneliness of long-term loss sets in. Alta found herself in a terrible limbo, unable to grieve properly because Melissa's fate remained unknown, unable to move forward because how do you move forward when your child is somewhere out there, possibly alive, possibly calling for you? She kept Melissa's room exactly as it had been, her toys arranged just so, her clothes still in the dresser. Some of Alta's friends and family gently suggested that this wasn't healthy, that she needed to accept what had happened and try to rebuild her life. But Alta couldn't. She refused. Acceptance felt like betrayal. To pack away Melissa's things would be to admit defeat, to declare her daughter truly gone. So the room remained a shrine, and Alta remained frozen in August 1971, even as the calendar moved relentlessly forward. The investigation's lack of progress wasn't due to police incompetence or lack of effort. It was a simple matter of having nothing to work with. The kidnapper had left behind no physical evidence. The white gloves ensured no fingerprints. The disguise prevented accurate identification. The fake name led nowhere. The use of public payphones meant no phone records to trace. And this was years before DNA evidence became a standard investigative tool, decades before surveillance cameras were ubiquitous, generations before the internet would make information sharing instantaneous. The investigative techniques available in the 1970s relied heavily on witnesses, physical evidence, and patterns that could be cross-referenced with known criminals. But there were no witnesses who saw anything useful. There was no physical evidence. And the kidnapper's pattern, if she had one, wasn't connected to any known suspects in police databases. Detectives were left with a description so generic it described thousands of women, and a crime so clean it seemed almost professional. Some investigators privately theorized that the kidnapper might have been someone who desperately wanted a child of her own and saw Alta's classified ad as an opportunity. Perhaps she was unable to have children naturally, or had lost a child and wanted to replace that loss. Perhaps she saw taking Melissa as a rescue of sorts, removing the girl from a single mother's struggles to give her a better life. These theories at least provided a motive that made some psychological sense, but they didn't bring investigators any closer to identifying the actual person. By 1973, 2 years after Melissa's disappearance, the case had effectively gone dormant. Fort Worth police would periodically review the file, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators had missed, but these reviews yielded nothing new. Alta and Jeffrey, meanwhile, continued their private search as best they could with the limited resources available to them. They traveled to neighboring states following tips that often came from well-meaning but mistaken people who thought they'd spotted a child resembling Melissa. Each trip required taking time off work they couldn't afford to miss, spending money they didn't have, and enduring the emotional roller coaster of hope building during the journey only to crash when the lead proved false. It was exhausting and heartbreaking, but they kept doing it because what else could they do? Sitting still felt impossible when their daughter was out there somewhere. The psychological impact of this prolonged uncertainty is difficult to overstate. Grief, when it has a definitive end, follows a somewhat predictable pattern: shock, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. But ambiguous loss, when you don't know if your loved one is alive or dead, prevents you from moving through these stages. You're stuck in perpetual limbo, unable to properly grieve because there's no confirmed death, unable to hope normally because hope itself becomes a source of pain when it's repeatedly crushed. Alta's relationship suffered. Her connection with Jeffrey, already strained before Melissa's disappearance, couldn't survive the weight of their shared loss. They divorced, though they maintained contact because of their continued search for Melissa. Alta struggled to form new relationships because how do you explain to a potential partner that you're emotionally tethered to a missing child, that part of your heart is permanently frozen in 1971, that you can never fully be present in the moment because you're always partially somewhere else, wondering and waiting? Friends who had been supportive in the immediate aftermath grew weary of the topic as years passed. It's not that they stopped caring, but there's only so long people can sustain intense sympathy before compassion fatigue sets in. Conversations became strained as Alta brought every topic back to Melissa, interpreting world events through the lens of her missing daughter. If a news story mentioned a kidnapping somewhere else, Alta would share it, hoping it might somehow connect to her case. If someone mentioned seeing a child who reminded them of someone, Alta would wonder if it could have been Melissa. Her entire existence had become defined by absence. And that kind of focus, while understandable, is difficult for others to endure indefinitely. The early 1970s saw increasing national awareness about missing children, though the infrastructure to address the problem was still rudimentary. Organizations were beginning to form. Advocacy groups were pushing for better law enforcement coordination across state lines, and slowly, Society was waking up to the fact that child abductions were not as rare as people wanted to believe. But for families like the Highsmiths, this growing awareness translated into frustratingly little practical help. There was no national database where missing children's information could be easily accessed by all law enforcement agencies. There was no coordinated system for age-progressing photographs to show what a missing child might look like years later. There was no internet platform where information could be shared instantaneously with millions of people. The tools that would eventually help find Melissa simply didn't exist yet. So Alta and Jeffrey did what they could with what they had. They kept Melissa's photograph circulating. They contacted every organization they heard about that might help. They followed up on every tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed. They became their own investigators, their own advocates, their own support system. Because if they didn't fight for Melissa, who would? The police had moved on. The media had moved on. The public had moved on. But a parent never moves on. That's not how love works. The years between 1975 and 1990 were defined by a peculiar kind of hope, the kind that sustains you through disappointment after disappointment, but never quite dies, because the alternative is unbearable. Alta Apantenco settled into what could only be described as a waiting life, where every birthday Melissa didn't celebrate with her, every holiday spent without her daughter, every milestone that passed unmarked became another weight in an already unbearable burden. She remarried eventually, had other children who would grow up knowing they had an older sister they'd never met, a ghost who haunted family photographs and dinner table conversations. These younger siblings grew up understanding that before this current family existed, there had been another beginning that ended in tragedy. They learned early that happiness in their household was always conditional, always shadowed by the empty chair at Thanksgiving, the missing face in birthday photos, the mother who would sometimes stare off into the distance with an expression they couldn't quite name but felt in their bones. Jeffrey Highsmith also tried to rebuild his life, but Melissa's absence colored everything he did. He had other children too, created new families, went through the motions of normalcy that society expects, but part of him remained permanently stationed in August 1971. Both parents lived dual existences, one foot in the present where they functioned, worked, raised their subsequent children, paid bills, celebrated achievements. The other foot remained stuck in the past, in that moment before the woman in white gloves took Melissa away, in the infinite possibility of what might have been. This split consciousness is common among parents of missing children. They're simultaneously here and not here, present and absent, moving forward while being pulled backward. It's exhausting in ways that people who haven't lived it can't fully comprehend. Every normal moment is underscored by abnormal grief. Every achievement is bittersweet because Melissa isn't there to witness it. Every family gathering is incomplete. The late 1970s and 1980s brought incremental improvements to how missing children cases were handled nationwide. The plight of missing children began appearing on milk cartons, a grassroots campaign that put faces and stories in front of millions of American families during their morning breakfast routines. These milk carton images were often haunting, black and white photographs of smiling children accompanied by basic information and a phone number to call with tips. Melissa's face appeared on these cartons, distributed throughout Texas and surrounding states, her toddler photograph frozen in time even as the real Melissa, wherever she was, would have been aging into adolescence. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was established in 1984, providing a centralized organization that could coordinate searches, provide resources to families, and work with law enforcement agencies across state lines. This was a huge development, suggesting that finally, society was taking the issue seriously and building infrastructure to address it. Alta immediately connected with NCMEC, providing them with everything she had: photographs, police reports, any documentation of Melissa's disappearance. In return, NCMEC began producing age-progressed images, using artists and early computer technology to create renderings of what Melissa might look like as she grew older. These age progressions became both a blessing and a curse for Alta. On one hand, they gave her something concrete to distribute, updated images that might help someone recognize adult Melissa in a way that baby photos couldn't. She'd carry these age-progressed sketches everywhere, showing them to anyone who'd look, posting them in grocery stores and gas stations and community centers. On the other hand, Seeing these artistic interpretations of her daughter's aging face was emotionally gutting. This is what Melissa might look like at age 10, at age 15, at age 20. Each progression represented years lost, childhood milestones missed, a relationship that should have existed but didn't. Alta would stare at these images, trying to memorize every detail, trying to see her baby in these older faces, trying to prepare herself for the possibility that if she ever saw Melissa again, she might not immediately recognize her. That possibility haunted her. What if they passed each other on the street someday and didn't know it? What if Melissa was living nearby under a different name and they'd been in the same grocery store or the same park without realizing it? The tips and leads continued sporadically throughout the 1980s and 1990s, each one sending Alta and Jeffrey on another emotional roller coaster ride. Someone in Oklahoma would call saying they'd seen a young woman who matched Melissa's age-progressed image. Alta would drop everything, make the drive, track down the woman in question, only to discover through conversation or a quick glance that it wasn't her daughter. Another time, a long-haul trucker contacted them claiming he'd given a ride to a hitchhiker who mentioned being raised under strange circumstances. Again, the Highsmiths would investigate, following the thread until it inevitably led nowhere. A social worker in New Mexico reached out once, convinced that one of her clients had a history that didn't quite add up, wondering if there might be a connection to missing children cases from the 1970s. Alta made that journey too, filled with the cautious hope that had become her default emotional state, only to have DNA testing, still relatively new but increasingly available, confirm that the woman was not Melissa. Each false lead was simultaneously crushing and motivating. Crushing because it meant they were still searching, still hadn't found her. Motivating because it proved they were still out there, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Jeffrey became particularly obsessed with following every possible thread, sometimes driving hundreds of miles on the slimmest possibility that a tip might pan out. His subsequent family sometimes struggled with this obsession, understandably frustrated that so much emotional energy and financial resources were devoted to a search that never seemed to end. But Jeffrey couldn't stop. He'd compare every young woman he encountered to the age-progressed images, looking for Melissa's eyes or her smile or the small birthmark that had been under her left eye as a baby. He'd strike up conversations with strangers, working Melissa's story into discussions in case they might have information. Some people thought he was eccentric or pushy. Others were moved by his dedication. Most probably just found him a bit sad, this man who couldn't let go of the past. But for Jeffrey, it wasn't about letting go or holding on. It was about simple mathematical logic. Until he had definitive proof that Melissa was dead, she was alive. And if she was alive, he had to keep looking. Any other choice was unthinkable. Alta maintained rituals that helped her feel connected to the daughter she couldn't touch. Every year on Melissa's birthday, she'd bake a cake and light candles, celebrating alone or with her other children who'd grown up participating in these ceremonies for a sister they'd never met. It might seem strange to outsiders, this celebration of someone who wasn't there, but for Alta, it was essential. Each birthday cake was a statement of faith, a declaration that Melissa existed somewhere, that she was worth commemorating, that her life mattered even in absence. Alta would make wishes as she blew out the candles, the same wish every year: bring her home. She kept a candle lit in her window on significant dates: Melissa's birthday, the anniversary of her disappearance, Christmas. Neighbors would see that flickering light and know what it meant: this beacon burning for a lost child, this small flame refusing to be extinguished by time or disappointment. The 1990s brought another technological revolution that would eventually prove crucial. DNA testing became more sophisticated and more widely available. Early in the decade, DNA evidence was primarily used in criminal prosecutions, famously helping to convict or exonerate people accused of violent crimes. But by the mid-1990s, DNA databases were being established that could potentially help identify missing persons or connect unknown remains to searching families. Alta and Jeffrey immediately provided their DNA samples to every organization and law enforcement agency that would accept them. The idea was simple: if unidentified remains were ever found, if a Jane Doe turned up somewhere, if any situation arose where Melissa's DNA might be available for comparison, their samples would be waiting in various databases, ready to confirm or rule out a match. They also provided DNA samples to nascent genetic genealogy databases, though these were primitive compared to what would exist 20 years later. The technology was promising, but the infrastructure wasn't there yet. Databases were small, disconnected from each other, and focused primarily on law enforcement applications rather than family reunification. Still, it represented hope, this idea that science might succeed where traditional detective work had failed. Throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Alta aged from a young mother into a middle-aged woman, then into someone approaching senior citizen status. Her face, which had appeared so young and devastated in those 1971 news broadcasts, now carried the accumulated weight of decades of grief. Gray hair replaced brown. Wrinkles appeared where smooth skin had been. Her body showed the wear of time and stress. But her determination never wavered. If anything, it intensified as she grew older, driven by the terrifying awareness that she had only so many years left to find her daughter. The mathematics of mortality became increasingly stark. Alta was in her 50s, then her 60s, then her 70s. How much longer did she have? If she died without finding Melissa, without knowing what had happened to her, without getting to hold her one more time, what would that mean? These thoughts drove her forward even when exhaustion and common sense suggested she should rest. She couldn't rest. Rest felt like surrender, and surrender felt like death. Friends and even some family members would occasionally suggest, as gently as possible, that maybe it was time to accept that Melissa was gone. Not gone necessarily as in dead, but gone in the sense of unrecoverable, lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control, a tragic mystery that might never be solved. These suggestions, though well-intentioned, infuriated Alta. How dare anyone ask her to give up? How dare they suggest she should stop looking for her child? They didn't understand, couldn't understand unless they'd lived it, that giving up on Melissa would be like cutting off her own arm. You don't just walk away from your child because time has passed or because the search has been hard. You keep going until you have definitive answers or until you physically can't search anymore. Alta chose to keep going. Every morning she woke up and made the decision to believe Melissa was alive, to believe she could be found, to believe that somehow, someday, the impossible would become possible. This wasn't naive optimism. Alta was too battle-scarred for naivety. It was intentional, almost aggressive hope. She chose hope as a strategy, as a survival mechanism, as the only ethical response to a mother's love. And somehow, against all odds and in defiance of all probability, that hope would eventually be vindicated. The early 2000s ushered in changes that would fundamentally transform how missing persons cases could be investigated, though it would take years for these tools to reach their full potential. The internet, which had been a niche technology in the 1990s, exploded into mainstream adoption. Suddenly, information that once required days or weeks to disseminate could travel globally in seconds. Social media platforms began emerging, first Friendster and MySpace, then Facebook in 2004, eventually Twitter and Instagram. These platforms created unprecedented opportunities for families of missing persons to share their stories, connect with others in similar situations, and keep cases alive in public consciousness long after traditional media had moved on. For the Highsmith family, particularly Melissa's younger siblings who had grown up in the shadow of their missing sister, these digital tools represented a revolution. They could do things their parents had never been able to do. Create permanent, searchable online presences for Melissa's case, connect with thousands of people instantaneously, leverage the collective power of internet communities to keep the search active. Around 2008, Melissa's siblings created a Facebook page called Finding Melissa Highsmith. It started simply enough. A collection of baby photos from 1971, scans of old newspaper articles about the kidnapping, the various age-progressed images that had been created over the years, and a narrative explanation of what had happened and what they were looking for. But the page quickly became something more than a digital memorial. It became an active hub where tips could be submitted, where people could share the information with their own networks, where the true crime community that was flourishing online could engage with the case. The siblings would post updates regularly, not because there were always new developments to report, but because maintaining visibility was crucial. They understood something that older generations sometimes missed. On social media, silence equals invisibility. If you're not posting, you're forgotten. So they posted. They shared anniversary remembrances on the date of Melissa's disappearance. They posted updates whenever Alta or Jeffrey appeared in media interviews. They engaged with comments and messages, treating every interaction as a potential lead, even when most led nowhere. The true crime community online proved to be an unexpected ally. Websites like Web Sleuths had emerged in the early 2000s, creating forums where amateur detectives could discuss unsolved cases, share theories, and occasionally crowdsource solutions to mysteries that had stumped professional investigators. Melissa's case found its way onto these forums, where users would dissect every known detail. They'd examine the description of the woman in white gloves, speculating about what kind of person would execute such a calculated abduction. Some theorized she was someone who had lost a child and wanted to replace that loss. Others suggested an illegal adoption ring might have been involved, though no evidence supported that theory. A few even wondered if the kidnapper might have been someone Alta knew, someone who had access to the newspaper ad before it ran publicly. These theories ranged from plausible to wildly speculative, but the value wasn't necessarily in their accuracy. It was in keeping the case active, keeping people thinking about it, keeping Melissa's name and face circulating through various corners of the internet. You never knew who might be reading, who might have information, who might make a connection that investigators had missed. The Highsmith siblings also learned to navigate the darker side of internet visibility. False leads multiplied in the digital age. People would contact them claiming to be Melissa or claiming to know where Melissa was, sometimes out of genuine confusion, sometimes out of malicious intent, sometimes out of mental illness that made them believe things that weren't true. Each of these contacts required investigation, required emotional energy, required the family to ride that familiar roller coaster of hope and disappointment. But they couldn't afford to ignore any of them, because what if the one time they dismissed a claim as too unlikely to pursue, it turned out to be real? So they followed up on everything, developing thick skins and low expectations while maintaining that core hope that kept them going. They learned to spot the obvious frauds relatively quickly. People whose stories had glaring inconsistencies or who seemed more interested in attention than in actually helping. But the less obvious cases, the ones that seemed just plausible enough to be true, those required serious investigation. DNA testing helped immensely here. By the 2010s, DNA testing had become relatively affordable and accessible. When someone claimed to possibly be Melissa, the family could arrange testing fairly quickly. These tests invariably came back negative, but at least they provided definitive answers rather than lingering uncertainty. Meanwhile, consumer DNA testing emerged as a phenomenon that would eventually transform the search for Melissa in ways no one anticipated in those early years. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA launched in the mid-2000s, offering people the ability to learn about their ethnic heritage and potentially connect with unknown relatives through simple at-home saliva tests. Initially marketed primarily as a genealogical curiosity, discover your ancestry, find distant cousins, build your family tree. These services quickly amassed massive databases containing genetic information from millions of people. By 2015, these databases included genetic profiles from millions of users. By 2020, that number had grown to tens of millions. People were voluntarily uploading their most personal information, their genetic code, to these databases for relatively innocent reasons: curiosity about heritage, interest in family history, desire to connect with relatives. But this massive accumulation of genetic data would eventually prove useful for purposes far beyond recreational genealogy. Law enforcement began to take notice, particularly after the 2018 identification and arrest of the Golden State Killer through genetic genealogy techniques. Investigators had used DNA from old crime scenes and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, not to find an exact match to the killer, but to find distant relatives who shared portions of his DNA. From there, investigators built family trees, identified possible suspects, and eventually narrowed their search to the right person. Alta and Jeffrey had been aware of these consumer DNA services for years, but it hadn't occurred to them that such tests might help find Melissa. They'd given their DNA to law enforcement databases, to missing persons organizations, to anyone official who might use it for comparisons. But consumer genealogy services seemed like something different, something more focused on ancestry exploration than active investigation. Their thinking, like that of most people, was constrained by how these services were marketed and commonly used. It took a shift in perspective, a recognition that these databases could be repurposed for missing persons searches before the potential became clear. That shift was happening gradually in missing persons advocacy communities throughout the late 2010s. Genetic genealogists, professionals, and hobbyists who specialized in using DNA to trace family connections began offering their services to families of missing persons. They'd take DNA from parents or siblings and upload it to public databases like GeneMatch, then look for matches that might indicate where the missing person's genetic material had ended up. Sometimes this meant identifying remains that had been found but never identified. Sometimes it meant discovering that adopted individuals were actually missing persons who had been trafficked or illegally adopted. And occasionally, very occasionally, it meant finding living people who had been missing for decades. The Highsmith siblings, who were more digitally savvy than their aging parents, began researching genetic genealogy around 2020. They read success stories about other cold cases being solved through consumer DNA databases. They learned about how the technique worked, uploading DNA profiles to public databases, looking for matches, building family trees to identify how the matches connected, narrowing down possibilities through traditional detective work. It seemed almost too simple to be true. This idea that a problem unsolvable by 50 years of police investigation might yield to a simple spit test and a website. But the science was sound and the success stories were real. They began encouraging Jeffrey and Alta to consider submitting their DNA to consumer services, not just to law enforcement databases. Alta was willing but somewhat skeptical. She'd been down so many roads that led nowhere that it was hard to believe this one would be different. Jeffrey was more intrigued, perhaps because as a man in his 70s, he felt the pressure of time more acutely. If something was going to break in this case, it needed to happen soon. He didn't have decades left to wait. The family's online presence also evolved to reflect changing social media landscapes. As Facebook's influence waned among younger users and platforms like Instagram and TikTok rose, they adapted, creating accounts across multiple platforms to maximize reach. A younger generation of true crime enthusiasts discovered Melissa's case through these newer platforms, bringing fresh attention to a story that had begun before their parents were born. TikTok in particular proved surprisingly effective for spreading information about cold cases. Users would create short videos summarizing cases, using trending audio and creative editing to make the content engaging. Several TikTok creators featured Melissa's story, each video reaching hundreds of thousands or even millions of views, spreading her name and face to audiences who had never encountered the case through traditional media. Some of these videos would include calls to action. If you took a DNA test and got unexpected results, if your parents' stories about your early childhood don't quite add up, maybe investigate further. You might be helping solve a decades-old mystery without even realizing it. By 2022, 51 years after Melissa's disappearance, the Highsmith family had built a multi-platform presence that would have been incomprehensible to Alta and Jeffrey in 1971. They had Facebook pages with thousands of followers, Instagram accounts, TikTok presence, connections to true crime podcasts that discussed the case, relationships with genetic genealogists who volunteered their expertise, and a network of supporters across the country and around the world. They'd done more than keep Melissa's memory alive. They'd built an active, engaged community around her case. And crucially, they'd positioned themselves at the intersection of old pain and new technology, ready to leverage whatever tools might finally provide the breakthrough they'd been seeking for 5 decades. That breakthrough was closer than they realized. All it would take was one DNA sample, 3 weeks of processing, and an algorithm designed to connect genetic relatives. The technology had finally caught up to their faith. The impossible was about to become possible. September 2022 brought another disappointment that would, ironically, catalyze the discovery that changed everything. An anonymous tip had come through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Someone in Charleston, South Carolina, had seen a woman who bore a strong resemblance to the most recent age-progressed image of Melissa. The caller didn't provide much detail, just a general area and a physical description that seemed to match what 53-year-old Melissa might look like. For the Highsmith family, this wasn't unusual. Tips came in sporadically, had for decades, and the family had learned to approach each one with cautious optimism that was really just well-managed pessimism. They'd been through this cycle enough times to know that most leads evaporated under scrutiny. But you couldn't not follow up. What if the one tip you dismissed turned out to be real? That possibility, however remote, meant you had to chase everything, no matter how tired you were, no matter how many times you'd been disappointed before. Several Highsmith family members made the trip to Charleston, carrying flyers with Melissa's photographs and prepared to canvass the area mentioned in the tip. They spent days walking neighborhoods, talking to locals, showing pictures to anyone who would look. Local media picked up the story. Texas family searches Charleston for missing daughter, which generated some additional visibility and a few more tips from well-meaning residents who thought they might have seen the woman in question. Eventually, they managed to arrange a DNA test with the woman who matched the description. She was cooperative and understanding, agreeing to provide a sample that could be compared to Jeffrey and Alta's DNA. The family waited with that familiar knot in their stomachs, the one they'd felt dozens of times before, hoping this time would be different while preparing for it to be the same. The results came back within a week, not a match. The woman who looked like Melissa wasn't Melissa. She was just someone with similar features, a coincidental resemblance, another false alarm in a 50-year string of false alarms. The Highsmith family thanked her for her cooperation, apologized for any inconvenience, and prepared to return to Texas with the exhausted disappointment they'd carried home from so many previous searches. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the complete professionalization of consumer DNA testing. Maybe it was the recent success stories they'd been reading about other cold cases being cracked through genetic genealogy. Maybe it was just that Jeffrey Highsmith had reached a point where he was willing to try anything, no matter how unlikely it seemed. On the flight back from Charleston, he found himself sitting next to one of Melissa's siblings, and they talked about what else they could possibly do. They'd tried everything traditional: police investigations, private investigators, age-progressed images, media coverage, social media campaigns, tips hotlines. They'd exhausted every conventional avenue multiple times over. What they hadn't done, at least not in a systematic way, was leverage the full power of consumer DNA databases. Jeffrey had given DNA samples to law enforcement agencies, but he hadn't uploaded his genetic profile to the public genealogy sites where millions of ordinary people were searching for their ancestry. A friend of the family, someone who dabbled in genetic genealogy as a hobby, had been suggesting this for a while. Why not submit your DNA to 23andMe or Ancestry, upload the raw data to GEDmatch, and see what matches come up? The logic was simple. If Melissa was alive somewhere, if she'd ever taken a consumer DNA test out of curiosity about her heritage, or if any of her children had, there might be a match waiting in these databases. It was a long shot, absolutely, but it was a long shot they hadn't fully taken yet. Jeffrey decided to do it. In early November 2022, he ordered a DNA kit from 23andMe. It arrived within a few days, just a small cardboard box containing a plastic tube, a prepaid return envelope, and instructions that were almost insultingly simple. Spit in the tube. Close it. Shake it. Mail it back. That's it. That's all that stood between decades of searching and potential answers. A few milliliters of saliva and a prepaid envelope. Jeffrey followed the instructions, feeling slightly ridiculous about how anticlimactic it all seemed. After 51 years of desperate searching, of following leads across multiple states, of enduring countless disappointments, the next step in finding his daughter involved spitting into a plastic tube and dropping it in a mailbox. He mailed the sample and tried not to think about it too much. The processing would take several weeks, and he'd learned long ago not to build up hope during waiting periods. Hope was something you approached cautiously, like a skittish animal that might bolt if you moved too quickly. The days passed. November in Texas is actually pleasant. The oppressive heat of summer has broken. The air turns crisp, and you can spend time outside without feeling like you're being baked alive. Jeffrey tried to occupy himself with normal life, whatever that meant at this point. He had grandchildren from his other children, people who loved him and depended on him, and a life that had somehow continued despite the permanent wound at its center. He didn't tell everyone in the family about the DNA test. There was no point in getting everyone's hopes up yet another time. This was just another thing he was trying, another long shot in a lifetime of long shots. If it led somewhere, he'd share the news. If it went nowhere like everything else, at least he'd spare everyone the disappointment. On November 22, 2022, Jeffrey received an email notification from 23andMe. The subject line was generic. Your DNA results are ready. He almost deleted it, assuming it would just be the standard ancestry breakdown that these services provided. He'd seen those before, percentages from various regions, information about genetic traits, maybe some distant cousin matches that meant nothing in the context of finding Melissa. But he opened it anyway because you don't not open it, not when you've been waiting 51 years for answers. What he saw on the screen didn't immediately make sense. His brain struggled to process the information because it was so far outside what he'd expected. The system had flagged 3 DNA matches that were categorized as extremely close relatives, close enough that the relationship could only be grandparent and grandchild. Jeffrey stared at the screen, reading and rereading that designation. The system was saying he had 3 grandchildren whose profiles were in the database. 3 people who shared enough of his DNA that they had to be his son's or daughter's children. He knew all his confirmed grandchildren, could account for each of them. These 3 profiles represented unknown grandchildren, which meant they had to belong to a child he'd lost contact with. And he'd only lost contact with one child, Melissa. The implications crashed over him like a wave. If these were Melissa's children, that meant Melissa had children, which meant Melissa was alive, had been alive long enough to grow up, have a family, raise kids who were now adults themselves. Melissa, who he'd last seen as a 21-month-old baby, was somewhere out there, probably not even knowing she was Melissa, living an entire life he knew nothing about. Jeffrey's hands were shaking as he took screenshots of the matches. The profiles showed first names and ages, but limited additional information because of privacy settings. Still, it was enough. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable. He immediately called one of Melissa's siblings, the one who'd been most involved in the online search efforts. His voice was barely steady as he explained what he'd found. They needed help interpreting this, needed to figure out how to proceed, needed to not screw this up, because if this was real, if this was actually Melissa after all these years, they couldn't afford to lose the trail. Melissa's sibling connected Jeffrey with Lisa Jo Rule, a genetic genealogist who had experience working with missing persons cases. Lisa Jo had volunteered her services to help other families navigate the complex world of DNA matching and had developed a reputation for being both skilled and compassionate. When she looked at Jeffrey's matches, she confirmed what he'd suspected. The genetic connections were too strong to be anything other than what the system said they were. These 3 individuals were his grandchildren, and they shared a parent who had to be his biological child. Lisa Jo began the painstaking work of building a family tree using the limited information available from the DNA matches and public records. She could see the usernames or first names associated with the 3 profiles. She could see approximate ages. She could access the shared genetic segments that indicated how these individuals were related to Jeffrey. From there, she started searching public records, social media profiles, marriage licenses, birth announcements, any public information that might help identify who these 3 people were and, more importantly, who their mother was. It didn't take long. The digital breadcrumbs were there if you knew how to follow them. Within a few days, Lisa Jo had identified a likely candidate, a woman named Melanie Walden, living in Fort Worth, Texas. The coincidences were staggering. Fort Worth, the same city where Melissa had been taken 51 years earlier. The woman's age matched. She was in her early 50s, which aligned with Melissa's birth year. Records suggested she didn't have a traditional birth certificate from a hospital, which fit the profile of someone whose identity might have been fabricated or altered. And most tellingly, Melanie Walden had 3 adult children whose names and ages matched the profiles that had pinged as Jeffrey's grandchildren. The Highsmith family obtained photographs of Melanie Walden through social media, pictures that friends or relatives had posted over the years. They studied these images with the intensity of people looking for proof of a miracle. And there, in several of the photos, visible just below her left eye, was a small birthmark. Melissa had been born with a birthmark in exactly that spot. It was documented in her baby photos, had been mentioned in the original missing persons reports, had been noted as an identifying feature on every poster and flyer for 51 years. The odds of all these factors aligning by coincidence, same city, right age, no clear birth record, matching birthmark, 3 children whose DNA matched Jeffrey as grandchildren, were astronomical. This had to be Melissa. Every rational analysis pointed to the same conclusion. But rational analysis wasn't enough. not after 51 years of disappointments. They needed direct confirmation. They needed to make contact with Melanie Walden and arrange proper DNA testing. They needed to be absolutely certain before they got Alta's hopes up, before they went public with this discovery, before they let themselves fully believe that the impossible had happened. Jeffrey took on the responsibility of making first contact. He crafted a Facebook message to Melanie Walden, trying to find words that could convey something fundamentally inconveyable. How do you tell someone via Facebook Messenger that you believe you're their father, that they've been missing for 51 years, that their entire life might be built on a lie? He kept it simple and direct, explained who he was, mentioned the DNA match, asked if she'd be willing to talk. Then he hit send and waited, knowing that on the other end, a woman who thought she knew who she was about to have her world completely upended. When Melanie Walden saw Jeffrey Highsmith's Facebook message, her first instinct was to dismiss it as spam or some kind of scam. The internet was full of people making outlandish claims, trying to manipulate others for various reasons, and a message from a stranger claiming to be your biological father certainly fell into the category of things that seemed too bizarre to be real. She'd grown up as Melanie, daughter of the woman who raised her, and while her childhood had been far from ideal, far from normal, really, she'd never had reason to believe she was anyone other than who she'd always been told she was. The idea that she might actually be a missing person, that somewhere out there people had been searching for her for decades, that her entire identity was something other than what she'd always known. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life. She showed the message to her husband with a mixture of amusement and annoyance, and they might have ignored it entirely except that Jeffrey had mentioned specific details that gave them pause. He'd said something about being from Fort Worth, about searching for a daughter for 51 years, about DNA matches. Those details had enough specificity to plant a seed of curiosity. Melanie's husband decided to do what anyone in the 21st century does when confronted with a strange claim. He Googled it. He typed Melissa Highsmith Fort Worth into the search bar and found himself falling down a rabbit hole that would change their lives forever. There were dozens of articles about a baby who disappeared in 1971. There was a Facebook page dedicated to finding her. There were age-progressed images showing what she might look like at various ages. There were photographs of Alta and Jeffrey Highsmith, still searching after all these years, their faces marked by decades of grief, but still determined. And there were baby pictures of Melissa from 1971, images that had been circulated on missing persons posters for half a century. Melanie's husband stared at these old photographs, then called Melanie over to look. They pulled up photos of Melanie as a baby from their own family albums and held them next to the screen. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The shape of the face, the eyes, the mouth, and there, in both sets of photographs, that small distinctive birthmark just below the left eye. Melanie felt something shift inside her as she looked at these side-by-side comparisons. It wasn't quite recognition, because how could she recognize a life she didn't remember? But it was something, a sense of pieces fitting together, of answers emerging to questions she hadn't fully known she had. Because here's the thing about Melanie's life, it had never quite made sense. The woman who raised her, the person she'd called mother, had been strange in ways that Melanie had learned to accept as normal because children accept what they're given. That woman had been intensely controlling and secretive, keeping Melanie isolated from other children, from neighbors, from anyone who might ask too many questions. Melanie had been told from her earliest memories that she'd been born at home, that she had brain damage that made her different from other kids, that the outside world was dangerous for someone like her. These explanations had been offered as concern, as protection, but they'd resulted in a childhood that was more prison than home. Melanie wasn't allowed to play outside unsupervised. She didn't have friends over. She rarely went to other kids' houses. When she did attend school, there were always reasons to keep her somewhat apart. She was special. She was fragile. She needed to be careful. The woman who raised her could be affectionate at times, but was more often cold, distant, quick to anger. Physical punishment wasn't uncommon. Emotional manipulation was constant. Melanie had grown up walking on eggshells, learning that silence was safety, that the best way to avoid trouble was to be quiet and compliant, and as invisible as possible. Even as a child, Melanie had felt a persistent, inexplicable sense that something wasn't right. She couldn't articulate it, didn't have the language or context to understand what she was feeling, but there was always this nagging sense of disconnection. Years later, trying to explain this feeling to reporters and family members, she'd say it was like being a puzzle piece forced into the wrong spot. You're there, you're part of the picture, but you don't quite fit. The edges don't line up. Something is off, but you're too young to understand what or why. She'd sometimes think to herself that she must have been born to the wrong person, a child's way of trying to make sense of feeling fundamentally misplaced. And now, looking at these baby pictures side by side, reading about a child who disappeared from Fort Worth in 1971, she was beginning to understand why she'd always felt that way. She had been born to the wrong person, or more accurately, she'd been taken from the right person and given to someone who had no right to her. Melanie wrote back to Jeffrey, her response careful and guarded, but open to the possibility that this outlandish claim might actually be true. She acknowledged the resemblance in the photographs and agreed to participate in DNA testing that would either confirm or rule out the connection. The Highsmith family moved quickly to arrange proper testing through an accredited laboratory, something that would provide results solid enough to satisfy both personal certainty and, potentially, legal proceedings. They sent testing kits to Melanie with detailed instructions, and she followed them, swabbing the inside of her cheek and returning the samples, all while her mind raced through the implications of what might be true. If she was Melissa Highsmith, that meant everything she'd been told about her origins was a lie. It meant her entire childhood had been built on a crime. It meant the woman who raised her was actually her kidnapper. These were not easy truths to contemplate. For a few days while the tests were being processed, Melanie existed in a strange limbo between identities, between realities. She was simultaneously Melanie Walden, the person she'd always been, and potentially Melissa Highsmith, someone else entirely. The results came back just before Thanksgiving 2022. The laboratory report showed a 99.9997% probability that Melanie Walden was the biological daughter of Jeffrey Highsmith and Alta Apantenco. In scientific terms, it was as definitive as these things can get. The child who had disappeared from Fort Worth in August 1971 had been found alive in November 2022, living just miles from where she'd been taken, having spent her entire life under a different name, completely unaware that anyone was looking for her. When Melanie received the test results, she had to sit down. The physical reality of it hit her all at once. She was Melissa. She had parents she'd never known. She had siblings who'd grown up searching for her. She had a name that was her birthright, a history that had been stolen from her, and 51 years of questions that could now be answered. But along with those answers came a crushing weight of grief for everything that had been lost. She'd missed her entire childhood with her real family. Alta had missed watching her daughter grow up. Jeffrey had missed teaching his little girl to ride a bike, helping with homework, walking her down the aisle at a wedding. Her siblings had grown up with an empty space where she should have been. All because one person in white gloves had walked into their lives and taken what wasn't hers to take. Melanie, who would soon legally reclaim the name Melissa, began the difficult process of piecing together what had happened to her. She was still in contact with the woman who had raised her, though their relationship had been strained for years. Armed now with DNA proof and the certainty that came with it, Melissa confronted this woman directly, asking for the truth about where she'd come from. The woman's response was both an admission and an evasion. She acknowledged knowing that Melissa was that baby from the missing persons case that had dominated Fort Worth news in 1971. She'd seen the posters, read the articles, knew that a family was desperately searching for the child she was raising. But she claimed she hadn't actually kidnapped Melissa herself. Instead, she offered a story about having purchased Melissa from another woman for $500, allegedly told that the baby's mother couldn't afford to keep her. This narrative, if true, would make her guilty of participating in an illegal adoption or child trafficking, but not of the actual kidnapping. Melissa didn't believe it. The story had too many holes, too many convenient details that couldn't be verified. If it had been a legitimate transaction, however shady, why the elaborate disguise on the day of the pickup? Why the fake name? Why the decades of hiding and isolation? Why keep Melissa away from doctors and schools and anyone who might ask questions? These weren't the actions of someone who'd participated in a quasi-adoption arrangement. These were the actions of someone who'd committed a crime and spent 51 years covering it up. Unfortunately, before investigators could formally question the woman or press her for more complete answers, she died. Her death in late 2022, coming just as the truth was emerging, meant that certain answers would never be known. The full story of why she took Melissa, what she was thinking that hot August day in 1971, whether she acted alone or had help, what her motivations truly were, all of this went to the grave with her. For Melissa, this added another layer of frustration to an already complex emotional situation. She'd been robbed of her childhood, her identity, and her family. Now she was being robbed of full closure, of the complete truth, of the accountability she deserved. The woman who had controlled and damaged her entire early life had escaped justice by dying before facing any legal consequences for what she'd done. Investigators reviewed the case and publicly stated their skepticism about the purchase story. There was no evidence of any transaction, no witnesses to corroborate it, nothing to suggest it was anything other than a last-minute attempt to reframe a kidnapping as something less culpable. The evidence all pointed to the same conclusion the police had reached in 1971. This had been a deliberate, premeditated abduction carried out by someone who'd carefully planned how to take a child and disappear with her. Melissa began processing the psychological impact of these revelations with help from therapists who specialized in trauma and identity issues. She was dealing with layers of abuse, the physical and emotional abuse of her childhood, the meta-abuse of having that abusive person turn out to be her kidnapper, and the existential trauma of discovering that your entire life has been built on a foundation of lies. She'd spent 51 years as Melanie, building a life and an identity around that name and that history. Now she was learning that Melanie was essentially a character, a false construct, and that the real her was Melissa, someone she didn't remember being. Integrating these two selves, the lived experience of being Melanie and the birthright reality of being Melissa, would be a long therapeutic journey. But she wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in her life, she had a family who wanted her, who had been searching for her, who loved her not because they had to or because she'd been forced into their lives, but because she was genuinely theirs and they were genuinely hers. That knowledge, however complicated everything else might be, was a gift beyond measure. The Highsmith family decided that Thanksgiving 2022 would be the day for their reunion, a choice that felt both symbolic and perfect. Thanksgiving, after all, is about gratitude, about recognizing blessings, about coming together with family. And what greater blessing could there be than having a missing family member returned after 51 years? What more appropriate occasion for gratitude than this? The gathering was arranged carefully, held at a relative's home in the Fort Worth area, private enough to allow genuine emotion without the immediate intrusion of media, though they knew that public announcement would come soon. Alta Apantenco, now 73 years old, prepared for this meeting with a mixture of joy and terror that's difficult to articulate. She'd imagined reuniting with Melissa thousands of times over the past 5 decades, dreamed it, prayed for it, visualized it during sleepless nights. But now that it was actually happening, the reality felt almost more overwhelming than the long absence had been. What do you say to a daughter you haven't seen since she was a toddler? How do you bridge 51 years in a conversation? How do you compress a lifetime of love and grief and longing into words that could possibly convey what you're feeling? When Melissa arrived at the house on Thanksgiving Day, stepping through the door into a room full of people who were her blood family but essentially strangers, the air seemed to vibrate with collective emotion. Dozens of family members had gathered. Jeffrey, Alta, Melissa's siblings, their spouses, grandchildren, extended relatives who'd all grown up hearing about the missing little girl. Every eye in the room was on Melissa, but she was looking for Alta, searching the crowd for the face of the mother she couldn't remember but had apparently been missing her entire life. When their eyes met across the room, something electric and ancient passed between them, a recognition that bypassed conscious memory and went straight to something deeper. Alta stood up slowly, her legs unsteady, and began moving toward this woman who was simultaneously a stranger and the most familiar person in the world. She was crying before she'd taken 3 steps, and Melissa was crying too, both of them moving toward each other as if pulled by gravity, by biology, by the magnetic force of a bond that had been stretched but never broken across 51 years. When Alta finally wrapped her arms around Melissa, when she felt the physical reality of her daughter alive and solid and real, she kept whispering, my baby," like a prayer or an incantation, like words that could somehow compress all the years of longing into this single moment of contact. Melissa held her mother. This woman who was her mother but whom she didn't remember, who felt both completely foreign and somehow right, and let herself cry in a way she rarely had in her life. The isolation and abuse of her childhood had taught her to keep emotions locked down, to stay controlled, to never show vulnerability. But here, in Alta's arms, those defenses crumbled. She'd spent her life feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, and suddenly she was being held by someone who had been looking for her since before she could remember. Jeffrey joined the embrace, wrapping his arms around both women, his voice breaking as he repeated 51 years over and over, as if the number itself contained all the weight of what they'd endured and overcome. Melissa's siblings crowded around them too, these brothers and sisters she'd never known existed, all of them crying and laughing simultaneously in that particular emotional chaos that happens when joy and grief collide. The room was filled with the sound of people trying to express the inexpressible, gasps and sobs and laughter all mixed together, the soundtrack of a miracle unfolding in real time. Melissa's own children were there too, her 3 adult kids who had unwittingly been the genetic key that unlocked this entire mystery. They were meeting grandparents they never knew they had, watching their mother discover a history that had been hidden from her, processing the reality that they were part of a family much larger and more complex than they'd ever imagined. The photographs from that Thanksgiving reunion capture something that transcends the usual family gathering snapshots. These images show faces radiant with an almost otherworldly joy, the kind of happiness that only comes from impossible things becoming possible. Alta's face, lined with 7 decades of life and 5 decades of grief, glows with relief so profound it's almost visible. Jeffrey stands tall despite his age, his expression mixing disbelief with vindication. He never gave up, and here was the proof that faith could be rewarded. Melissa herself looks overwhelmed but peaceful, like someone who's finally found solid ground after a lifetime of walking on quicksand. The hours that followed were filled with storytelling from both sides, each family member wanting to share pieces of the life Melissa had missed, wanting to learn about the life she'd actually lived. Alta showed Melissa photographs from her childhood that Melissa had never seen. Baby pictures of herself at 6 months, at 1 year, at 20 months, just before she disappeared. Melissa stared at these images of a chubby, happy baby in Alta's arms, trying to connect that infant to herself, trying to access memories that simply weren't there because she'd been too young when she was taken. Alta had kept everything: Melissa's baby clothes, her first shoes, toys she'd played with, all preserved in boxes for 51 years on the faith that someday, somehow, Melissa would come home. Now here she was, and Alta could finally give her these tangible pieces of her stolen infancy. Jeffrey shared stories about what he'd been doing the day Melissa was taken, about the immediate aftermath, about the decades of searching. He talked about all the false leads they'd followed, all the times they'd thought they were close only to be disappointed, all the ways they'd kept her memory alive. Melissa listened to these stories and felt the weight of all that loss, all that pain that had been caused by one person's decision to take her. She thought about her own children and couldn't imagine the agony of having them stolen, of spending decades not knowing if they were alive or dead, safe or suffering. The empathy she felt for what her parents had endured was almost unbearable. Melissa also began sharing pieces of her own story, though some parts were too painful to fully articulate just yet. She talked about her childhood in careful terms, acknowledging it had been difficult without going into the darkest details right away. She mentioned that she'd always felt like something was wrong, that she'd run away at 15 because life with her captor had become intolerable, that she'd struggled through her teenage years and early 20s without the foundation or support that should have been there. Alta wept hearing these bare facts, imagining the suffering her daughter had endured while Alta searched desperately for her, never knowing she was so close by. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Melissa had been in Fort Worth, the same city where she'd been taken, living just miles away from her real family, all while Alta plastered the city with missing posters and Jeffrey followed leads to other states. They'd been searching the country when the answer was in their own backyard. How many times might they have been in the same grocery store, the same shopping center, the same streets, passing within feet of each other without knowing? These questions would haunt Alta in quiet moments, though she tried to focus on gratitude rather than regret. Melissa was home now. That was what mattered. The family took photographs together, posed and candid shots that would document this historic reunion. They took multi-generational pictures with Alta and Jeffrey flanked by all their children, Melissa included, and all their grandchildren, including Melissa's 3 kids. These photos showed a family suddenly complete after being fractured for 51 years. All the empty spaces finally filled. Someone joked that they needed to take extra pictures because they had 51 years of photos to make up for, and everyone laughed even though they were crying, because laughter and tears were pretty much the same thing that day. As the afternoon stretched into evening, as the initial overwhelming emotions settled into something more sustainable, the family began discussing practical next steps. Melissa would need to officially reclaim her birth name, which would require legal proceedings. There would be medical records to obtain, family histories to share, paperwork to navigate. The Fort Worth Police Department would need to formally close the case, which would involve their own confirmation testing and procedures. And perhaps most significantly, there would be media to deal with. This story was too remarkable to stay private. The Highsmiths knew that once news broke about the reunion, it would generate intense public interest. Missing child cases that get resolved after decades always make headlines. But this one had additional elements that would capture attention. The length of time, the use of consumer DNA testing, the fact that Melissa had been in Fort Worth all along, the Thanksgiving timing. It had all the elements of a story that would resonate far beyond their personal experience. 2 days after the Thanksgiving reunion, on November 26, 2022, the Highsmith family decided to go public with their miracle. They organized a gathering at a church in Fort Worth that held special significance. It was where Alta had attended prayer vigils for Melissa over the years, where the community had gathered to support the family during their darkest times. Now it would be the site where they'd announce Melissa's return to the world. Word had already leaked to some local reporters who'd covered the case over the years, and when Alta, Jeffrey, and Melissa walked into the church hall together, the assembled crowd erupted in applause and gasps of amazement. Some of the people present had been following this case for decades, had seen the posters, had read the articles, had watched Alta's pain unfold over the years. To see her now, standing with her recovered daughter, was almost surreal. Alta addressed the crowd and the cameras with a voice that shook with emotion but never wavered in its message. She spoke about never giving up hope, about the decades of searching, about the faith that sustained her when everyone else thought she should let go. She talked about the moment she first saw Melissa after 51 years and how it felt like time collapsing, like all the years of separation suddenly meant nothing compared to the reality of having her daughter back. Jeffrey spoke too, his usual reserve cracking under the weight of what they were announcing to the world. He emphasized the role of DNA technology, how a simple consumer test had accomplished what decades of traditional investigation couldn't. He held up the DNA test kit, just a small plastic tube, and said this tiny thing had given him back his daughter. It was a powerful visual, this contrast between the simplicity of the tool and the magnitude of what it had achieved. Melissa's statement to the press was perhaps the most emotionally complex. She acknowledged the joy of finding her family, but also the pain of everything that had been stolen from her. She talked about living her entire life under a false identity, about the abuse and isolation she'd endured, about finally understanding why she'd always felt like she didn't belong. She expressed gratitude for being found, but also grief for the 51 years that could never be recovered. Her honesty about the complicated emotions involved resonated deeply with people watching. This wasn't just a simple happy ending. It was a bittersweet reunion that acknowledged both the miracle of the discovery and the tragedy of what had been lost. When asked how it felt to finally know who she really was, Melissa paused before answering, clearly struggling to articulate something profound. Finally, she said that it felt like she'd been holding her breath her entire life without knowing it, and now she could finally exhale. She'd spent 5 decades feeling fundamentally wrong, fundamentally out of place, and now she understood why. The wrongness wasn't her. It was the circumstances she'd been forced into. Finding her real family didn't erase the past or heal all the wounds, but it gave her a truth to build on, a foundation that was actually real instead of constructed from lies. The press conference generated exactly the kind of media attention the family had anticipated. Within hours, the story was picked up by national news outlets. By that evening, it was trending on social media platforms. Major newspapers including the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today ran prominent stories. Television networks led their evening news broadcasts with it. The headline writers had a field day. Thanksgiving miracle. Missing baby found after 51 years. DNA test solves five-decade mystery. Woman discovers she was kidnapped as toddler. The case that wouldn't die. How consumer DNA found missing child. People magazine would later do a full feature spread. Morning talk shows invited the family to appear and tell their story. The case became a touchstone in discussions about missing children, cold cases, and the power of DNA technology. Online, the hashtag DNA wins began trending, a phrase the Highsmith family had used in their social media announcement. It captured something essential about the story, that science had finally caught up to hope, that technology had achieved what faith alone couldn't, though both were necessary for the outcome. The Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, which had been quietly maintained for years with modest follower counts, suddenly exploded with new attention. Thousands of people shared the posts, left comments celebrating the reunion, expressed how moved they were by the family's perseverance. Many comments came from other families of missing persons, saying that Melissa's case gave them hope to keep searching, to never give up, to try new technologies even when traditional methods had failed. In the following weeks, the family navigated the strange adjustment of being suddenly public figures in a story that captivated the country. They gave interviews, appeared on television, shared their story repeatedly to different audiences. Alta, who had been doing this for decades in the hope of finding Melissa, now did it to celebrate finding her and to encourage other families. Jeffrey, less comfortable with media attention, nevertheless participated because he understood that their story could help others. Melissa herself was careful about her media appearances, setting boundaries around what she would and wouldn't discuss publicly, particularly regarding the details of her abusive childhood. She was willing to share the broad strokes to help people understand the impact of the crime, but she reserved the most painful specifics for private therapeutic processing. In May 2023, Melissa took a step that was both practical and deeply symbolic. She legally reclaimed her birth name. In a courtroom in Tarrant County, Texas, with Alta and Jeffrey by her side, she petitioned to officially change her name from Melanie Walden to Melissa Suzanne Highsmith. The judge, clearly moved by the circumstances, granted the petition immediately. When the order was signed, the courtroom erupted in applause from family members and supporters who had gathered to witness this moment. For Melissa, signing legal documents with her real name for the first time in her life was extraordinarily emotional. This name wasn't just a label. It was a reclamation of identity, a rejection of the false life that had been imposed on her, an acceptance of her true history and family. She was finally, legally, officially, Melissa Highsmith, the person she'd been born as and should have been all along. The resolution of Melissa Highsmith's case sent ripples far beyond one family's reunion. Within weeks of the public announcement, the Highsmiths found themselves at the center of a broader conversation about missing persons, cold cases, and how modern technology could be leveraged to solve seemingly unsolvable mysteries. They recognized that their personal miracle could become something larger, something that might help other families still trapped in the agonizing uncertainty they'd finally escaped. The Finding Melissa Highsmith Facebook page, which had been created years earlier to locate her, transformed into a resource hub for other families of missing persons. The Highsmith siblings, particularly those who had managed the social media presence and coordinated the DNA testing, began fielding hundreds of questions from people wanting to know exactly how they'd done it. How do you order a DNA test? Which company is best? What do you do with the results? How do you interpret matches? Can this work for my missing loved one? The family answered these questions patiently and thoroughly, understanding that for many people, they represented hope, proof that cases decades old could still be cracked if you had the right tools and refused to give up. Melissa herself became an advocate, though she approached it carefully given the trauma she was still processing. She was willing to speak publicly about the importance of DNA testing and about never losing hope, but she was also honest about the complicated emotions that came with being found. In interviews and speaking engagements, she emphasized that finding your missing loved one doesn't automatically equal a fairy tale ending. There are layers of grief and loss to process, questions that might never be answered, time that can't be recovered. For her, being found meant finally having truth in family, but it also meant confronting painful realities about what had been done to her and what she'd missed. She wanted other families to understand that reunion, while miraculous, is also the beginning of a long healing process, not the end of the journey. Her honesty about this complexity made her a particularly credible voice in the missing persons advocacy community. She wasn't selling false hope or pretending everything was perfect now. She was offering realistic hope grounded in her actual experience, which was far more valuable and trustworthy. The Highsmith case became a teaching tool in law enforcement and forensic science circles. At conferences and training sessions, investigators studying cold cases would analyze what had made the Highsmith resolution possible and how those lessons could be applied to other cases. Several key factors emerged from these analyses. First, the family's absolute refusal to give up or accept that the case was unsolvable. Without that persistent pressure to keep the case active, without their continuous efforts to seek new approaches, Melissa likely never would have been found. Second, the willingness to embrace new technology even when traditional methods had failed. Jeffrey's decision to try consumer DNA testing wasn't made with high expectations. It was a long shot taken because there were no other shots left to take. Third, the timing. By 2022, consumer DNA databases had grown large enough that the probability of finding relevant matches had increased dramatically from even 5 years earlier. If Jeffrey had done the same test in 2015, the databases were smaller and the match might not have been there. Fourth, the geographical proximity. Melissa had remained in the Fort Worth area, and her children had apparently taken DNA tests that ended up in the same database Jeffrey used. If she'd moved far away, or if her children hadn't happened to use that particular service, the connection might never have been made. These factors illustrated both the power and the limitations of genetic genealogy for solving missing persons cases. It worked spectacularly well in certain circumstances, but it wasn't a magic solution that would work for every case. Law enforcement agencies began re-evaluating their approach to cold missing persons cases in light of the Highsmith success story and others like it. Some progressive departments established dedicated genetic genealogy units or partnerships with civilian genealogists who could analyze DNA evidence in ways that traditional forensic labs weren't equipped to do. The Fort Worth Police Department, which had carried the Highsmith case for 51 years, issued a formal statement in May 2023 officially closing the case and acknowledging that it had been solved not through traditional police work, but through the family's initiative and consumer DNA technology. The statement was notable for its honesty. The department acknowledged that they'd had no active leads for decades, and that without the family's persistence and use of modern technology, the case would likely have remained unsolved forever. This kind of institutional humility was refreshing and suggested a recognition that solving cold cases would increasingly require collaboration between law enforcement and civilian resources. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children also took note of the Highsmith case and announced new initiatives to help families use genetic genealogy tools. They began offering guidance on how to submit DNA to consumer databases, how to interpret results, and how to work with professional genealogists who volunteered their time to help with missing persons cases. They created educational materials explaining the process in terms that non-experts could understand, demystifying what it seemed like highly technical science and making it accessible to ordinary families. NCMEC spokesperson publicly credited the Highsmith case with changing how they thought about old cases, acknowledging that families could be active investigators rather than just passive victims waiting for professionals to solve their cases. The ripple effects extended to the consumer DNA testing companies themselves. 23andMe, the company whose service had facilitated the Highsmith discovery, featured the case in promotional materials emphasizing that their platform could do more than just reveal ethnic ancestry. It could reunite families and solve mysteries. This created some controversy in privacy advocacy circles, where concerns about law enforcement and others using DNA databases for purposes beyond personal genealogy had been growing. The debate over privacy versus public good, particularly in missing persons and criminal cases, intensified. Some people argued that if you're voluntarily putting your DNA in a database, you should understand it might be used to solve crimes or find missing persons, and that this was an acceptable trade-off. Others worried about the potential for abuse, for governmental overreach, for genetic surveillance becoming normalized. The Highsmith case, because it was so sympathetic and because it involved a family's initiative rather than law enforcement surveillance, generally fell on the positive side of this debate. Most people agreed that using DNA databases to find missing children and reunite families was a good use of the technology, even if they had concerns about other applications. This helped create a social consensus that consumer DNA testing for family reunification purposes was not only acceptable but laudable, which in turn encouraged more families to try it and more people to understand that submitting their DNA might someday help solve a case they didn't even know was connected to them. Within a year of Melissa's discovery, the Highsmith family and the organizations they worked with could point to dozens of cases where their advocacy and advice had helped generate new leads or even full reunions. Not every story was as dramatic or as long-running as Melissa's, but each represented a real family finding answers they'd been seeking, often for years. A woman in Oregon who had been adopted in the 1960s used techniques the Highsmith shared to discover she'd actually been abducted as a baby and illegally adopted out. Her biological parents had died still searching for her, but she was able to connect with siblings who'd never given up hope. A man in Texas discovered through DNA testing that he was the child of a missing woman from the 1970s, leading to the resolution of a cold case and the identification of remains that had been found decades earlier but never identified. These successes, large and small, represented the tangible impact of the Highsmith family turning their personal tragedy and triumph into a broader mission of help and hope for others. They'd moved from being victims of a crime to being advocates for justice, from being searchers to being guides who could show others the way because they'd successfully walked the path themselves. Alta Apantenco, in the final chapters of her life, though hopefully with many years still ahead, found a kind of peace she'd never experienced in the previous 5 decades. She'd spent the majority of her life defined by loss, by absence, by the aching question of where her daughter was. Now she could finally release that burden. Melissa was home. Not home in the sense of living in the same house, or even the same neighborhood. They were all adults with separate lives and homes, but home in the sense of being back in the family where she belonged, known and loved, and no longer missing. Alta could finally sleep without wondering if Melissa was safe. Could finally look at family photos without that stabbing pain of incompleteness. Could finally answer the question, "How many children do you have?" without having to explain the complicated, painful story of the one who was missing. She had all her children now, accounted for, present, real. The relief of that was almost physical, like setting down a weight she'd been carrying so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. She continued to participate in advocacy work when her health and energy permitted, wanting other families to benefit from what she'd learned, wanting other mothers to experience the miracle she'd been granted. When she spoke at events or gave interviews, there was a lightness in her voice that hadn't been there before 2022. The grief was still there. All those lost years couldn't be erased, but it was now accompanied by gratitude and joy rather than consuming her entirely. Jeffrey Highsmith similarly found himself in a new phase of life. He'd spent decades carrying the guilt and pain of being separated from his daughter, channeling that pain into relentless searching. Now he could direct his energy toward building an actual relationship with adult Melissa rather than chasing the ghost of baby Melissa. They talked regularly, getting to know each other as people rather than as abstract concepts of father and daughter. It was strange and wonderful and sometimes awkward, as any relationship between adults who are meeting for the first time would be, but it was also deeply meaningful. Jeffrey had grandchildren from Melissa he'd never known existed, and he was getting to build relationships with them too. He expressed in interviews that while he grieved the 51 years he'd lost with Melissa, he was determined to make the most of whatever time they had left together. At his age, time was precious and finite, and he wasn't going to waste a moment of it. His persistence had been vindicated. Everyone who'd told him to give up, to move on, to accept that Melissa was gone had been proven wrong. She'd been alive all along, and his refusal to stop searching had ultimately led to the breakthrough that found her. There was a quiet satisfaction in that vindication, though he was too gracious to say, "I told you so" to anyone. The reunion itself was reward enough. As for Melissa, she continued the ongoing work of integrating her two selves and building a future that honored both her lived experience and her reclaimed identity. She had relationships to repair with her own adult children, family connections to build with the Highsmiths, trauma to process from her childhood, and an entirely new understanding of who she was to integrate into her sense of self. It was exhausting and overwhelming work, but she had resources now she'd never had before: a family who loved her, financial and emotional support, access to therapy and counseling, and the fundamental stability that comes from knowing the truth about your origins. She wasn't Melanie anymore, living a lie without knowing it. She was Melissa, daughter of Alta and Jeffrey, sister to her siblings, and she had a history and identity that was real and verifiable in hers. That foundation, solid for the first time in her life, gave her something to build on as she moved forward. She chose to view her story not as 51 years of loss, but as a second chance at life. She'd survived her abduction and abuse. She'd raised children. She'd made it through the darkest times. And now she had the opportunity to experience family and belonging in a way she never had before. She was determined to make the most of that opportunity. The Highsmith story, in the end, is about more than just one family's reunion. It's about the intersection of old-fashioned determination and cutting-edge science. It's about refusing to accept that some questions are unanswerable. It's about the power of a mother's love that spans decades and never diminishes. It's about technology used for its highest purpose, reuniting people who belong together. And it's about hope, that fragile but resilient thing that kept Alta lighting candles in her window year after year, that kept Jeffrey following leads no matter how unlikely they seemed, that kept Melissa's siblings maintaining that Facebook page and updating those age-progressed images, that kept an entire family believing against all odds that somehow, someday, the impossible might become possible. On November 22nd, 2022, when that email notification popped up on Jeffrey's screen saying DNA match found, 51 years of hope was finally, miraculously vindicated. The woman in white gloves had stolen a baby in 1971, but she couldn't steal that family's faith in reunion. Science and love, working together, had brought Melissa Highsmith home at last. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in the power of never giving up, then I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button to honor every family still searching for their missing loved ones. Share this video because you never know who might see it. Someone might recognize a face, remember a detail, or be inspired to take a DNA test that could solve another decades-old mystery. And subscribe to Cold Case Chronicles because stories like Melissa's prove that cold cases aren't closed cases. They're just waiting for the right technology, the right information, or the right person to come along and crack them wide open. Every subscribe helps keep these cases in the public eye. Every share might reach the one person who has the information that solves a case. Every engagement tells families still searching that they're not alone, that people care, that their missing loved ones haven't been forgotten. Remember Melissa's story the next time you think something is impossible. Remember Alta lighting that candle in her window for 51 years. Remember Jeffrey spitting into that tube and changing everything. Remember that DNA wins, but only if you're willing to try. Stay hopeful, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next case.